A quiet English village, a chilling announcement in the local paper. A murder is announced. Tonight at 6:30, Little Paddocks. Is it a prank, a game, or a deadly promise? When a stranger dies and secrets unravel, Miss Jane Marple steps into the shadows of Chipping Cleghorn, who place the sinister notice. Why is Letitia Blacklock hiding her past? And, as poison claims another life, can Miss Marple untangle a web of greed, deception, and hidden identities before the killer strikes? Again, dive into a mystery where every smile hides a lie, and every clue leads to danger. Chapter 1. The announcement the village of Chipping Cleghorn lay nestled in a gentle curve of the Cotswolds. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the crisp October light of 1950. To an outsider, it was a postcard of English serenity. Climbing stone walls, the church spire piercing a sky of scudding clouds. But to its residents, it was a web of secrets, where every smile hid a story and every glance carried a question. On this particular Friday morning, the village hummed with an unusual energy, sparked by a single, startling sentence in the Chipping Cleghorn Gazette. Miss Jane Marple, perched delicately on a chintz sofa in Mrs. Dolly Bantry's drawing room, adjusted her spectacles and peered at the newspaper. Her lavender-gloved fingers traced the inked words as if they might yield their meaning through touch alone. A murder is announced, she read aloud, her voice soft but sharp, and will take place on Friday, October 29th, at Little Paddocks, at 6:30 p.m., friends accepted, please. She tilted her head, her pale blue eyes narrowing. Now, Dolly, what do you make of that? Mrs. Bantry, a robust woman with a penchant for gardening and gossip, leaned over from her armchair, her cheeks flushed with curiosity. It's positively bizarre, Jane. A murder announced, as if it were a tea party or a bridge game. Surely it's one of Letitia Blacklock's little jests. She's always been fond of theatricals, hasn't she? Miss Marple's lips pursed, forming a faint line that suggested disagreement. Theatricals are one thing, my dear, but this has a peculiar edge. Letitia Blacklock is no fool. She wouldn't invite such attention without reason. She folded the newspaper with a crisp snap and set it on the tea tray, where a pot of Darjeeling steamed beside a plate of scones. Who lives at Little Paddocks now, besides Letitia? Oh, quite a crowd, Mrs. Bantry said, ticking off names on her fingers. There's Dora Bunner, her old-school friends, but scatty as a sparrow. Then those cousins, Patrick and Julia Simmons, young and dreadfully modern, and that foreign cook, Mitzi, who screams about everything. I believe Colonel Easterbrook and his wife are frequent visitors, too. Quite a mix, don't you think? Quite. Miss Marple murmured, her mind already spinning threads of possibility. In her village of St. Mary Mead, she had seen how the smallest oddities, a misplaced letter, a hurried glance could unravel the tightest secrets. This announcement felt like a pebble dropped in a still pond, its ripples hiding something darker beneath. I think, she said, rising with a rustle of her tweed skirt, I shall pay a call at Little Paddocks this evening. It's not every day one is invited to a murder. The lane to Little Paddocks was a charming path, bordered by blackberry hedges and punctuated by the chatter of sparrows. Miss Marple walked slowly, her black handbag swinging, her eyes darting. To every detail, the scuff of a boot in the mud, the flicker of a curtain in a nearby cottage. Chipping Cleghorn was not her village, but villages, she knew, were much the same everywhere. Small worlds where secrets grew like weeds. Little Paddocks itself was a rambling house, its red brick softened by ivy and its windows aglow with lamplight. As Miss Marple approached, she saw figures moving within, their silhouettes darting like moths against the curtains. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and impending rain. She knocked, and the door swung open to reveal Letitia Blacklock, a woman of about 50, with sleek dark hair and a smile that was both warm and wary. "Miss Marple," Letitia exclaimed, her voice smooth as polished oak. "What a delight! Do come in. I suppose you've seen the absurd notice in the Gazette. I can't imagine who placed it, some prankster, no doubt." Miss Marple stepped into the hall, noting the polished floorboards and a vase of late dahlias on a side table. "A prankster with a curious sense of humour," she said lightly. "I couldn't resist coming to see what it's all about." The drawing room was a hive of activity. Dora Booner, a fluttery woman with a knitted cardigan and a nervous laugh, was arranging chairs in a haphazard circle. "Oh, Letty, it's like organising a village fete," she twittered. "Everyone's coming, Mrs. Swettenham, the Hinchcliffes, even that dear Colonel Easterbrook. They all think it's a game." Patrick Simmons, a lanky young man with a roguish grin, lounged against the fireplace. "A game with a twist, I'll bet," he said, winking at his sister, Julia, who sat flipping through a magazine with studied boredom. Julia's auburn hair gleamed under the chandelier, and her sharp green eyes flicked up to meet Miss Marple's. "You're the detective lady, aren't you?" she said, her tone teetering between curiosity and mockery. "Come to solve our pretend murder." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as benign as a vicar's wife. "I'm merely an observer, my dear. But I do find human nature endlessly fascinating." The room filled as more guests arrived. Mrs. Swettenham, a widow with a penchant for dramatic hats, swept in, clutching her son Edmund, a bookish young man who blushed at every introduction. Miss Hinchcliffe, a sturdy woman in tweeds, arrived, with her companion, Miss Murgatroyd, both whispering about the ridiculous announcement. Colonel Easterbrook, ramrod-straight and mustachioed, muttered about damned nonsense, while his young wife Laura fluttered nervously at his side. Mitzi, the cook, peeked from the kitchen door, her dark eyes wide with something between fear and excitement. Letitia clapped her hands, her composure unruffled despite the growing crowd. "Well, everyone, since you're all here for this mystery, shall we call it, let's make an evening of it. Drinks, perhaps. Patrick, be a dear and fetch the sherry." As glasses clinked and conversation buzzed, Miss Marple settled into a corner armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly. She watched Letitia move among her guests, her laughter bright but her eyes darting, as if searching for an unseen threat. Dora Bunner hovered near her, chattering about old school days, but her hands trembled as she passed a tray of biscuits. Patrick and Julia exchanged a glance Miss Marple couldn't quite read: amusement or something sharper. The Colonel's bluster seemed forced, and Laura's nervous giggles grated like a mistracked piano key. The clock on the mantel, a heavy brass affair, ticked toward 6:30. The room grew quieter, the air thickening with expectation. Mrs. Swettenham whispered loudly to Edmund, "Do you think there'll be a mock corpse?" "How thrilling!" Edmund rolled his eyes, but his fingers tightened around his glass. Miss Hinchcliffe snorted, muttering about silly games, while Miss Murgatroyd clutched her arm, wide, dash-eyed. Miss Marple's needles paused. She felt it prickle at the nape of her neck, the same instinct that had warned her of trouble in St. Mary Mead. This was no game, she thought, or if it was, someone had rewritten the rules. She glanced at the windows. their curtains drawn tight, and noted the faint creak of a floorboard in the hall. Letitia, standing near the fireplace, was speaking to Dora, her voice low but urgent. "You mustn't worry, Bunny. It's all under control." The clock struck 6:30, its chimes echoing like a warning bell. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then, with a suddenness that made Miss Murgatroyd yelp, every light in the house went out. Darkness swallowed the room, thick and absolute, broken only by a collective gasp and the clatter of a dropped glass. "Stay calm, everyone." Letitia's voice cut through the chaos, steady but strained. "It's just a fuse, I'm sure." Her words were drowned by a new sound, a sharp, deliberate creak from the direction of the front door. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting, her senses straining. A rustle of fabric, a muffled step, then silence. The guests whispered, their voices a jumble of fear and excitement. "Is this part of it?" Mrs. Swetnam hissed. "Oh, it's too much." Then, as swiftly as it had vanished, the light returned. The chandelier blazed, revealing the room in stark clarity. Guests blinked, disoriented, their faces a tableau of shock and relief. Letitia stood frozen by the fireplace, her hand pressed. To her cheek, Dora clutched a chair, her face ashen. Patrick laughed, a touch too loudly, while Julia's eyes darted to the door. Miss Marple scanned the room, her mind racing. No one was missing, no one hurt, yet the air felt charged, as if the promised murder had brushed past them like a ghost. She rose, her movements unhurried, and crossed to the window, twitching the curtain aside. The garden beyond was dark, but a faint smudge in the dew on the lawn caught her Aja footprint, perhaps leading toward the hedge. "Well," she said, softly, turning back to the room, "that was rather dramatic, wasn't it?" Letitia forced a smile, but her eyes were wary. "A silly prank," she said, her voice a shade too bright. "Nothing to worry about. Shall we have more sherry?" The guests laughed, the tension breaking like a snapped thread, but Miss Marple's smile was thin. She returned to her chair, her needles resuming their rhythm. The announcement had promised a murder, and though no blood had been spilled, she felt the shadow of intent. Someone in this room or just beyond it had set a stage, and Miss Marple knew the play was far from over. Chapter 2. The shot in the dark. The lights flared back to life in little paddocks, casting the drawing room in a harsh glow that seemed to expose every nervous twitch and sidelong glance. Miss Jane Marple stood by the window, her knitting tucked neatly into her handbag, her eyes sweeping the room like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. The guests, still reeling from the sudden blackout, laughed uneasily, their voices overlapping in a brittle attempt to restore normalcy. Letitia Blacklock, ever the composed hostess, clapped her hands, her smile a touch too bright. Well, that was an adventure. "Patrick, more sherry, please." But before Patrick could move, a new sound shattered the fragile, sharp, splintering crash from the front hall, as if the door had been flung open with force. A collective gasp rose, and Miss Murgatroyd clutched Miss Hinchcliffe's arm, whispering, "What now?" Colonel Easterbrook's hand instinctively went to his pocket, as if expecting a weapon, while Laura, his wife, let out a small squeak. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her slight frame tensing like a cat sensing a storm. The drawing-room door burst open, and a figure stumbled in, a man, his face obscured by a black scarf wound tightly over his mouth, his eyes wild above it. He wore a dark overcoat, sodden from the drizzle outside, and in his gloved hand gleamed a revolver, its barrel catching the chandelier's light. The room froze, a tableau of shock, as the man's voice rasped out, low and guttural, "Nobody. Move. This is no game." Dora Booner let out a strangled cry, dropping her sherry glass, which shattered on the parquet floor. Letitia stepped forward, her hands raised, her voice steady despite the pallor creeping into her cheeks. "Please, whoever you are, there's no need for this. What do you want?" The man's eyes darted across the room, lingering on Letitia, then flicking to the guests huddled behind her. Miss Marple noted his hesitation, the slight tremor in his grip. He was nervous, she thought, not a seasoned criminal. Her mind catalogued details, the scuffed boots, the faint scent of tobacco clinging to his coat, the way his scarf slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of a stubbled chin. "Stay back," he barked, waving the gun. "I'm here for his." Words cut off as his gaze locked on Letitia, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening crack, the revolver fired. 2 shots rang out, sharp and final, echoing off the walls. Letitia staggered, clutching her ear, where a thin trickle of blood seeped through her fingers. The man swayed, his eyes wide with shock, and collapsed face down on the rug, the gun clattering from his hand. Chaos erupted. Mrs. Swetnam screamed, her hat tumbling off as she clutched Edmund, who stared open-mouthed. Patrick lunged forward, kicking the gun across the room, while Julia knelt beside Letitia, her usual composure replaced by a flash of genuine concern. "Letty, are you all right?" she demanded, pressing a handkerchief to Letitia's ear. "It's just a graze," Letitia said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm fine, really." She pushed Julia's hand away, her eyes scanning the fallen man, then darting to the doorway as if expecting another intruder. Miss Marple moved swiftly, her age belying her agility, and knelt beside the man. She pressed, 2 fingers to his neck, her touch gentle but precise. "He's dead," she announced quietly, her voice cutting through the clamor. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like dust. She lifted the scarf carefully, revealing a stranger's face, slow, unshaven, with a faint scar above one eyebrow. "Does anyone know this man?" she asked, her tone mild but probing. Letitia shook her head, her hand still pressed to her ear. "Never seen him before. He must be a madman." But her eyes flickered, and Miss Marple caught it a fleeting shadow of recognition. Or perhaps fear. Colonel Easterbrook, recovering his bluster, strode forward. "Damned outrage. Barging in here, waving a gun. We need the police at once." He turned to Patrick. "Boy, fetch the constable. Go." Patrick hesitated, glancing at Letitia, who nodded. "Yes, go, Patrick. Hurry." As he dashed out, Miss Marple rose, her eyes lingering on the dead man's coat, where a crumpled piece of paper protruded from a pocket. She resisted the urge to touch it, knowing the police would need to see it undisturbed within minutes. The sound of boots announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a lean man with sharp eyes and a nonsense air. Behind him came Constable Legg, a local lad who looked faintly green at the sight of the body. Craddock surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering on the gun, the blood on Letitia's ear, and the stunned faces of the guests. "Right," he said briskly. "Nobody leaves this room until I've had statements. Miss Blacklock, you're in. Get that scene too first." Mitzi, the cook, appeared at the doorway, her apron twisted in her hands, her voice a wail. "I knew it. I told you all. This house is cursed. First the lights, now this." She pointed at the body, her accent thickening with panic. "He comes to kill us all." "Enough, Mitzi," Letitia snapped, her composure fraying. Go back. To the kitchen, Mitzi fled, muttering, leaving a ripple of unease in her wake. Craddock knelt beside the body, his gloved hands deftly searching the man's pockets. He extracted the crumpled paper, a torn page from a notebook, scrawled with the words Little Paddocks, 6:30, don't fail. He held it up, his brow furrowing. Looked like he was sent here, or came with a purpose. Anyone care to explain? This, his eyes swept the room, settling on Letitia. I've no idea, she said, her voice steady again. That notice in the Gazette brought all sorts here tonight. Perhaps he was a lunatic, drawn by it. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the fireplace, watched the exchange. She noted the way Letitia's fingers tightened on her handkerchief, the way Dora Bunner's eyes darted to her friend, wide with unspoken worry. Julia, now standing by the window, stared out into the dark garden, her face unreadable. Patrick returned, breathless, and whispered something to Craddock, who nodded. The inspector turned to the guests. This man's name, according to his wallet, is Rudy Schurz, Swiss by his papers. Worked at a hotel in Medenham Wells until recently. Ring any bells? Heads shook, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of tension in Colonel Easterbrook's posture, a slight clenching of his jaw. As Craddock began taking statements, Miss Marple slipped into the background, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She listened as Mrs. Swetnam recounted the blackout with theatrical flair, as Edmund mumbled about being too startled to notice much, and as Miss Hinchcliffe gruffly dismissed the intruder as some fool with a grudge. But it was Dora Bunner's nervous chatter that caught her ear. It's all so dreadful, isn't it, Letty? Like that time in London, when never mind. She stopped, her cheeks flushing, as Letitia shot her a sharp look. Miss Marple's mind turned, piecing together fragments. The blackout, the announcement, the stranger's precise timing. It was no random act. Rudy Schurz had come for a reason, and his death suggested he was a pawn in a larger game. The shots, she recalled, had been oddly timed, the first grazing Letitia, the second filling Schurz. An accident or a deliberate misdirection. And Letitia's grazed convenient, perhaps. For a woman so calm under fire, Craddock finished his initial questions and addressed the room. We'll need to search the grounds and take the body for examination. Miss Blacklock, I suggest you see a doctor for that ear. Everyone else, stay in the village until we've spoken again. He paused, his eyes narrowing. This announcement wasn't a game. Someone wanted Schurz here, and someone wanted him dead. The guests dispersed, murmuring as Letitia escorted Craddock to the door, promising to visit the doctor tomorrow. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the rug where Schurz had fallen, now marked by a faint stain. She approached Letitia, her voice gentle. A dreadful shock, my dear, but you handled it remarkably well. Letitia's smile was tight. One does what one must, Miss Marple. Thank you for your concern. She turned away, but not before Miss Marple saw the flicker of unease in her eyes, as the guests drifted into the night. Miss Marple stepped onto the porch, the drizzle cool against her face. The footprint she'd glimpsed earlier was gone, washed away by the rain, but its memory lingered. She thought of her nephew Raymond's tales of stage magic, magic misdirection, sleight of hand. This, she knew, was no parlor trick. The announcement had drawn a crowd, and Scherz's death had turned the stage crimson. Someone in Little Paddocks had orchestrated this night, and Miss Marple, with her quiet smile and sharper mind, intended to find out who. Chapter 3. The Village Whispers. The morning after the chaos at Little Paddocks dawned grey and damp, with a mist curling through Chipping Cleghorn's lanes like a conspirator's whisper. Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner table in the Blue Bird tea shop, her hands folded neatly over her handbag, a pot of Earl Grey steaming before her. The shop, with its gingham curtains and chipped china, was the village's beating heart, where secrets were traded as freely as sugar cubes. Today, the air buzzed with a single topic, the death of Rudy Schurz and the sinister announcement that had drawn him to his doom. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her pale blue eyes scanning the room over the rim of her cup. The villagers, huddled in knots, spoke in hushed tones, their words punctuated by furtive glances. At a nearby table, Mrs. Swetnam, her hat adorned with an improbable peacock feather, leaned toward Miss Murgatroyd, her voice carrying a theatrical lilt. "I tell you, Amy, it was no accident. That man burst in like something out of a penny dreadful, gun and all. Poor Letitia, grazed by a bullet. Imagine." Miss Murgatroyd, round-faced and perpetually startled, clutched her teacup. "But why? Lavinia, why announce a murder? It's positively ghoulish." Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, who offered a benign smile, as if she were merely enjoying the scones. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from idle. Rudy Scherz's death had been no random act, she was certain. The announcement in the Chipping Cleghorn Gazette had been a lure, and Scherz, with his trembling grip and desperate eyes, had been baited like a fish. But for whom and why? The graze on Letitia Blacklock's ear too precise, perhaps, for chance nagged at her, as did Letitia's composure, a polished veneer that hid. What, in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen such facades crack, revealing greed, fear, or betrayal beneath. The bell above the shop door jingled, and Dora bustled in, her knitted cardigan askew, her cheeks flushed from the chill. She spotted Miss Marple and hesitated, then made her way over, her steps as fluttery as her voice. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it awful? Poor Letty, so shaken, and that dreadful man. I couldn't sleep a wink, not a wink." She sank into the chair opposite, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. There, Miss Bunner," Miss Marple said soothingly, pouring her a cup of tea. "It was a terrible shock. But you knew Miss Blacklock in her younger days, didn't you? Perhaps you can shed light on why someone might target her." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, catching the flicker of unease in Dora's face. "Oh, Letty's always been so strong," Dora said, her voice faltering. "We were at school together, you know, in Bath. She was always the clever one, always helping me with my sums. But after her sister passed, she changed. Went to work for that financier, Randall Godler, in London. Such a grand life, but—" She trailed off, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting someone to listen. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft as a confessor's. But something troubled her, didn't it? Something from those days. She thought of the torn paper in Scherz's pocket, scrawled with Little Paddocks, 6:30. A connection to Letitia's past, perhaps. Dora's fingers tightened on her handkerchief, tearing a small hole. "Oh, it's nothing, really. Just Letty used to say the past has a way of catching up, like a shadow you can't outrun. But that's silly, isn't it?" She laughed, a brittle sound, and stood abruptly. "I must get back. Letty needs me. She's so brave, but this has shaken her." As Dora hurried out, Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hands. the way her eyes avoided meeting anyone else's. A shadow you can't outrun, she thought. Dora knew something, however small, and it frightened her. The tea-shop door jingled again, admitting Inspector Craddock, his coat dusted with mist. He nodded to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of respect and wariness. Miss Marple, a word. He joined her, lowering his voice. "We've identified Scherz's employer in Meddenham. Welser Hotel, called the Royal Spa. He was a porter, dismissed last month for Oddly, he'd been asking questions about a guest from years ago. A woman who stayed there under the name Lottie Black. Mean anything to you?" Miss Marple's needles, which she'd resumed knitting, paused mid-stitch. "Lottie Black," she murmured, a diminutive, perhaps, for Letitia Blacklock, or someone close to her. She thought of Dora's mention of Letitia's sister, dead long ago, so the story went. Did Scherz leave any other clues? Craddock frowned, producing a small photograph from his pocket. It showed a young woman, dark-haired and smiling, standing outside a grand hotel. Found this in Scherz's lodgings. The backs inscribed, "Lottie, 1940. Could be coincidence, but I don't like coincidences." Miss Marple studied the photograph, her mind racing. The woman's smile was Letitia's, but younger, softer, or was it? In St. Mary Mead, she'd known twins mistaken for one another, identities swapped like cards in a game. Very curious. She said, handing it back, "You might ask Miss Blacklock about her time at the Royal Spa." Discreetly, of course. Craddock nodded, rising. "I'm headed to Little Paddocks now. Care to join me?" Miss Marple declined with a smile, citing a need to rest her old bones. In truth, she preferred the tea-shop's chatter, where tongues wagged freer than under an inspector's gaze. As Craddock left, she turned her attention to the other patrons. At a far table, Colonel Easterbrook sat with his wife, Laura, his voice booming about security measures while Laura nodded, her eyes vacant. Nearby, Miss Hinchcliffe muttered to Miss Murgatroyd about a shady character seen near the church last week, lurking like a fox. The most intriguing conversation, however, came from Patrick and Julia Simmons, who slipped into the shop just as the clock struck 11. Patrick, his roguish charm dimmed by fatigue, ordered coffee while Julia scanned the room, her green eyes sharp as cut glass. They chose a table near Miss Marple, unaware of her quiet scrutiny. "Julia, you're being paranoid," Patrick said, his voice low but carrying. "Nobody saw you at the station. Besides, it's done now." Julia's lips tightened, her fingers drumming the table. "Don't be so sure, Pat. That man Scherz he wasn't random. He knew something, and someone wanted him quiet." She glanced around, her gaze skimming past Miss Marple, who appeared engrossed in her knitting. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her ears caught every word. The station, she thought. Had Julia been meeting someone or seeing someone? Off, and what did Scherz know? She recalled the torn paper, the photograph, Dora's nervous chatter. Pieces of a puzzle, scattered but forming a shape. The door jingled again, and Edmund Swetnam entered, his nose buried in a book. He nearly collided with Patrick, who grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "Edmund, old boy, still lost in your poetry. You missed the real drama last night." Edmund flushed, adjusting his glasses. "I saw enough. That man, it's like something out of Poe. Mother says it's a vendetta, but I think it's greed. Always is, isn't it?" He shuffled to his mother's table, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his words. Greed, she thought. Randall Godler's fortune, perhaps. Letitia had worked for him, and fortunes had a way of drawing vultures. As noon approached, the tea shop emptied, the villagers drifting back to their routines. Miss Marple paid her bill, leaving a generous tip for the waitress, whose gossip had been as useful as her tea. She stepped into the misty street, her mind turning over the morning's harvest. Dora's slip about Letitia's past, the photograph of Lottie Black, Julia's cryptic talk of the station, Edmund's mention of Gridit, all pointed to a web spun long before the Gazette's announcement. She paused by the village green, where a blackbird trilled from a yew tree. Scherz's connection to the Royal Spa was no coincidence, she decided. He'd been asking about Lottie Black, a name tied to Letitia, someone posing as her. Had he come to Little Paddocks to blackmail, to expose, or to claim something? His death suggested someone feared his knowledge, and the staged murder was a cover for a real one. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her lips curving in a faint smile. In St. Mary Mead, she'd unravelled knots far tighter than this. The village whispers had given her a thread to pull, and pull it she would. As she turned toward Mrs. Bantry's cottage, a new question formed. What had Dora meant by a shadow you can't outrun? The answer, she suspected, lay not in the tea shop's chatter, but in the silences between. Chapter 4. The shadow of the past the mist had lifted by mid-afternoon, leaving Chipping Cleghorn bathed in a pale autumnal glow. Miss Jane Marple walked the path to Little Paddocks, her sensible shoes crunching on fallen leaves, her mind turning over the whispers gathered in the Bluebird tea shop, Dora Booner's nervous mention of Letitia Blacklock's past, the photograph of Lottie Black from the Royal Spa, and Julia Simmons' cryptic talk of the station had woven a thread of suspicion. Rudy Scherz's death was no accident, Miss Marple was certain, but a piece of a larger pattern, one rooted in secrets buried long ago. At Little Paddocks, the house seemed quieter today, its ivy-clad walls absorbing the sunlight rather than reflecting it. Miss Marple knocked, and Mitzi, the cook, opened the door, her eyes red-rimmed, her apron clutched like a shield. Miss Blacklock is in the parlour, she said, her voice thick with unease. But it's not safe here, I tell you. First, the lights, then that man next, who knows? She crossed herself and retreated to the kitchen, muttering about curses. In the parlour, Letitia sat by a low fire, a bandage on her ear where Rudy's bullet had grazed her. She looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Miss Marple, how kind of you to visit. I'm afraid we're still reeling from last night's unpleasantness. Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her handbag on her lap. Quite understandable, my dear. Such a shock, and so public, with that dreadful announcement. Have you any idea who might have placed it? Her tone was gentle, but her gaze was sharp, noting the way Letitia's fingers tightened on her teacup. None at all, Letitia said, her voice smooth as polished stone. Some prankster, perhaps, or someone with a grudge. I worked for Randall Godler years ago. You know, a financier, very wealthy. People like that attract enemies. She laughed, a light sound that rang hollow. Miss Marple nodded, her mind latching onto the name Randall Godler. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned him, a man whose fortune cast a long shadow. You must have led a fascinating life in London, she said, her knitting needles appearing as if by magic. All those grand offices, important people. Did you ever meet anyone unusual there? Someone who might resurface now? Letitia's smile faltered, just for a moment. Oh, it was all so long ago. Just paperwork and meetings, really. Nothing to interest anyone now. She rose, smoothing her skirt. Would you like to see the garden? The roses are still lovely, despite the season. Miss Marple agreed, sensing Letitia's desire to change the subject. As they stepped onto the lawn, she noticed a photograph on the mantel. A young woman, dark-haired and smiling, standing beside a man in a pinstriped suit. The resemblance to Letitia was striking, yet the eyes were softer, the posture less guarded. "What a charming picture," Miss Marple said. "Is that you, Miss Blacklock, in your London days?" Letitia glanced at the photograph, her expression unreadable. "Oh, that's an old friend. From before the war. She's gone now." Her voice was brisk, closing the door on further questions. The garden was a patchwork of fading roses and neatly trimmed hedges, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth. Miss Marple admired a late-blooming climber, her eyes scanning the ground for clues. The footprint she'd glimpsed last night was gone, erased by rain, but a broken twig near the gate caught her attention, snapped, not fallen, as if someone had pushed through in haste. She filed it away, her thoughts returning to the photograph. An old friend, Letitia had said. Or perhaps a sister, like the one Dora mentioned, presumed dead. Back at Mrs. Bantry's cottage, Miss Marple found her friend pruning roses with a vigour that suggested she was battling more than weeds. "Jane, you're back. Any news from Little Paddocks?" "The village is positively alight with theories, Edmund. Swettenham swears it's a gang from London, and Miss Hinchcliffe thinks it's local mischief." Miss Marple smiled, settling onto a garden bench. "Theories are like dandelions, dolly plentiful, but often rootless. Tell me, what do you know of Letitia's time with Randall Godler? She mentioned him today, and I sense there's more to it." Mrs. Bantry snipped a thorn with a flourish. "Oh, Letitia was his secretary, or some such, for years. He was a tycoon, pots of money, houses everywhere. When he died, there was talk of a will something about Letitia inheriting if his wife passed first. But that was ages ago, and his wife's still alive, last I heard, in some nursing home. Why think it's connected to that awful man's death?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "Money has a way of stirring trouble, like sediment in a pond. And Rudy Schurz was asking about a Lottie Black at the Royal Spa. I wonder if Letitia, or someone close to her, was there." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Lottie Black. That's intriguing. You don't think Letitia's hiding something, do you? She's always been so. Proper." Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Proper people, Dolly, often have the most to hide. I think a visit to the church might be in order. Gravestones can be remarkably talkative. The church of St. Mary's stood at the edge of the village, its grey stone weathered by centuries of rain and prayer." Miss Marple entered the churchyard, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, her eyes scanning the rows of headstones. She'd always found cemeteries peaceful, their silence a canvas for the stories of the dead. Today she sought a name, or perhaps Godler, or even Lottie. Near the yew tree she found it, a modest stone, half covered in moss, inscribed with Charlotte Blacklock, 1915 to 1940, taken too soon. The dates matched Letitia's age, more or less, but Dora had spoken of a sister, and Letitia had dismissed the photograph as an old friend. Miss Marple knelt, brushing away the moss. Below the name, a faint line of text read. Her light shines on words felt personal, almost coded, unlike the usual platitudes of grief. As she traced the inscription, footsteps crunched behind her. She turned to see Miss Hinchcliffe, her tweed jacket patched at the elbows, her expression gruff but curious. Miss Marple, poking about in the churchyard. Not much to see here but old bones and older grudges. Miss Marple rose, dusting. Her gloves, oh, I find old stones quite revealing. This one, for instance, Charlotte Blacklock. Did you know her? Miss Hinchcliffe's brow furrowed. Heard the name, maybe Letitia's sister, wasn't she? Died young, consumption or some such. Letitia never talks about her. Why the interest? Just tying loose ends, Miss Marple said lightly. After last night, one wonders about connections. You mentioned a stranger near the church. Last week did you see anything distinctive? Miss Hinchcliffe snorted. Tall chap, city coat, skulking. By the looked like he was waiting for someone. Didn't like the cut of his jib, I'll tell you that. She paused, her eyes narrowing. You think he's tied to that Schurz fellow? Possibly, Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. Villagers are small, but their secrets are deep. She thanked Miss Hinchcliffe, who strode off toward her farm, leaving Miss Marple alone with the gravestone. The inscription nagged at her. Her light shines on in St. Mary Mead. She'd once solved a theft by noticing a similar phrase in a hymn book, a clue to a hidden will. Could this be a message, or merely sentiment? And why had Letitia dismissed the photograph so quickly? The Royal Spa, Randall Godler, Charlotte Blacklock, the threads were tangled. But Miss Marple felt the shape of a truth emerging. She returned to Mrs. Bantry's as dusk settled, the sky bruised with clouds. Over tea, she shared her findings, omitting the gravestone for now. Dolly, I think Letitia's past holds the key. Schurz knew something perhaps about this Lottie Black, or about Godler's fortune. Someone wanted him silenced, and the someone is closer than we think. Mrs. Bantry set down her cup, her eyes gleaming. You're like a bloodhound, Jane. What's next? A trip to Medenham Wells to snoop about that hotel. Miss Marple chuckled. Perhaps, but first, I'd like to speak to Dora Bunner again. She's nervous, and nervous people often let slip more than they intend. She leaned back, her needles resuming their rhythm. The gravestone's words echoed in her mind, a beacon in the fog of the mystery. Charlotte Blacklock was gone, but her shadow lingered, and Miss Marple suspected it stretched far beyond the churchyard. Chapter 5. The second victim. The October chill had deepened in Chipping Cleghorn, wrapping the village in a shroud of frost that glittered under the morning sun. Miss Jane Marple, now a guest at Little Paddocks at Letitia Blacklock's insistence, sat in the dining room, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the clink of breakfast china. The house felt taut, its air heavy with the echo of Rudy Scherz's death and the cryptic gravestone of Charlotte Blacklock, whose inscription her light shines on, lingered in Miss Marple's mind like a half-heard melody. The village was abuzz with fear and speculation, but here, within these walls, the tension was a living thing, coiled and waiting. Letitia, her ears still bandaged, presided over the table with a strained smile, passing toast to Dora Bunner, who fidgeted with her napkin, her eyes darting to the windows. Patrick Simmons, sprawled in his chair, teased Julia about her coffee, his grin masking a restlessness Miss Marple noted. Julia, her auburn hair pinned tightly, responded with a sharp quip, her gaze flickering to Letitia as if gauging her mood. Mitzi, serving porridge with jerky movements, muttered about bad omens until Letitia's sharp glance silenced her. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes soft but alert. The gravestone had confirmed Dora's mention of her sister, yet Dismissal of the photograph as an old friend suggested a deliberate evasion. Rudy Scherz's inquiries at the Royal Spa about Lottie Black pointed to a secret tied to Letitia's past, perhaps linked to Randall Godler's fortune. But why kill Scherz? And who had orchestrated the announcement in the Gazette? The answers, she sensed, were in this room, hidden in glances and silences. The morning's peace shattered when Mitzi burst in, her face ashen, a tea tray clattering in her hands. "Miss Bunner, she is sick," she cried, pointing to Dora, who had slumped forward, her teacup spilling across the tablecloth. A faint froth clung to her lips, and her eyes were wide, unseeing. Letitia leaped to her feet, her chair scraping. "Dora, oh heavens, call Dr. Haydock." Patrick dashed for the telephone, while Julia knelt beside Dora, her fingers searching for a pulse. Miss Marple, moving with quiet urgency, reached Dora's side, noting the acrid scent of almonds in the spilled tea. "Don't touch the cup," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the panic, and opened the windows quickly. Julia obeyed, flinging open the sash, while Letitia cradled Dora's head, her face a mask of shock. "Dora, darling, please," she whispered, but Dora's body was limp, her breath stilled. Miss Marple's heart sank. Poison, she thought, and not by accident. The tea had been meant for someone else, Letitia, perhaps, who always took hers with milk. Unlike Dora's plain brew, Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. Dr. Haydock, a brisk man with a surgeon's hands, confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. Cyanide, swift and lethal, likely in the tea. "She was gone before she hit the table," he said, his voice low. Someone knew what they were doing. Craddock sealed the dining room, sending Mitzi, now sobbing hysterically, to the kitchen with Constable Legg. He turned to Letitia, who stood by the fireplace, her hands clasped tightly. "Miss Blacklock, that tea was it yours?" Letitia nodded, her voice steady despite her pallor. "I poured it from the pot, but Dora asked for it. She said she liked the blend. I didn't think—" Her voice broke, and she turned away, her shoulders trembling. Miss Marple watched, her mind racing. The tea had been poured from a communal pot, but only Dora's cup was tainted. A sleight of hand, then, in the bustle of breakfast, she glanced at the sideboard, where a small medicine bottle sat among the jam jars a tonic Letitia took for nerves. Its label smudged, but legible. "Inspector," she said softly, "you might test that bottle. Cyanide can be disguised in such things." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, signaling Legg to bag the bottle. He addressed the household, Patrick, Julia, and Letitia, now joined by a shaken Mitzi. "Nobody leaves Little Paddocks until we've searched every inch. 2 deaths in 2 days, both tied to this house. I want answers." As Craddock began his questions, Miss Marple slipped into the garden, needing air to think. The frost-crusted grass crunched underfoot, and she followed a path to the greenhouse, where a broken pane caught her eye. Inside, among pots of wilting geraniums, she found a faint dusting of white powder on the workbench, its scent faintly chemical. Not gardening lime, she thought, but something more sinister. She left it untouched, knowing Craddock's men would need to see it. Returning to the house, she found Mitzi in the kitchen, her hysteria giving way to a flood of words. "I saw someone," Mitzi blurted, her eyes wild. "Last night, after the police left, a shadow by the laurel bushes. Tall, moving fast, like a ghost. I told Miss Blacklock, but she said I was imagining things." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "You're very observant, Mitzi. Did this shadow carry anything? A bag, perhaps, or a bottle?" Mitzi shook her head, her braids swinging. "No, just moving, quick-like, toward the lane. I swear, this house will kill us all." She buried her face in her apron, and Miss Marple let her be, her mind turning to the laurel bushes. Another footprint, perhaps, or a discarded clue. Back in the parlour, Craddock was questioning Patrick, who lounged with forced nonchalance. "Was in the garden smoking when Dora took the tea," he said. "Didn't see a thing. Rotten luck, though, poor old Bunny." His tone was light, but his fingers drummed the armrest. A nervous tick, Miss Marple noted. Julia, beside him, was less composed, her green eyes flashing. "This is absurd, Inspector. First that gunman, now poison. Someone's targeting Letty, and Dora got in the way. You should be searching the village, not badgering us." Craddock's gaze was steely. "And you, Miss Simmons, where were you when the tea was poured?" "In my room, brushing my hair," Julia snapped. "Ask Mitzi, she brought me a cup earlier." But her eyes flicked to Letitia, a glance so fleeting Miss Marple nearly missed it. Letitia, now seated, spoke up. "Inspector, I blame myself. That tea was mine. If I hadn't given it to Dora." Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple saw genuine grief, but also something else, a calculation, perhaps, in the set of her jaw. As Craddock moved to inspect the kitchen, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on Dora's empty chair. She recalled Dora's nervous chatter in the tea shop, her mention of Letitia's sister, Charlotte, and the shadow you can't outrun. Had Dora known something dangerous, something tied to the gravestone or the royal spa? Her death suggested she'd been a threat or a mistake. In a plan meant for Letitia, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Bantry bustled in, her face alight with concern. "Jane, I heard about Dora. Poison, they're saying, how dreadful. Is Letitia all right?" She lowered her voice, glancing at the others. "The village is in a panic. Miss Hinchcliffe swears she saw that stranger again, near the post office." "This morning," Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. "Thank you, Dolly. I think it's time for a little misdirection." She excused herself, slipping into the hall to find the telephone. She dialed the vicarage, speaking briefly. To the vicar's wife, a notorious gossip. "My dear," she said, her voice conspiratorial, "I heard the most curious thing. Someone saw a man hiding a bottle near the church last night. Could you pass it along? Discreetly, of course." Hanging up, Miss Marple smiled. In St. Mary Mead, she'd learned the power of a well-placed rumour. If the killer was in little paddocks, or nearby, they'd hear of this bottle and react, perhaps, by returning to the church or betraying their guilt in a glance. It was a subtle trap, but traps, she knew, caught the unwary Dot as evening fell. Craddock returned with news. The medicine bottle contained traces of cyanide, confirming Miss Marple's suspicion. "Someone tampered with it," he said, his eyes on Letitia. "Miss Blacklock, who had access to your tonic." "Anyone?" "In the house," Letitia said faintly. "It's kept on the sideboard." "I never thought." She trailed off, her hand touching her bandaged ear. Miss Marple watched the household Patrick's forced calm, Julia's sharp retorts, Mitzi's fear, Letitia's grief. The trap was set, the rumour spreading. Dora's death had raised the stakes, and the killer, she sensed, was growing desperate. As she retired to her guest room, her knitting in hand, she thought of Charlotte Blacklock's gravestone. The shadow of the past was lengthening, and Miss Marple intended to step into its light. Chapter 6. The alibi unravels. The frost had tightened its grip on Chipping Cleghorn, turning the lanes to glass and the breath of its residents to fleeting clouds. Inside little paddocks, the atmosphere was no less brittle, the shadow of Dora Bonner's poisoning lingering like a stain. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting a quiet rhythm against the crackle of the fire. Her rumour about a bottle near the church was now rippling through the village, and she watched the household Letitia Blacklock, Patrick and Julia Simmons, and the jittery Mitzi for any sign of a reaction. The cyanide in the medicine bottle, meant for her but fatal to Dora, suggested a killer close at hand, and Miss Marple's instincts told her the truth was near. Hidden in a careless word or a faltering glance, Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after breakfast, his face etched with the fatigue of a man chasing shadows. He gathered the household in the parlour, his notebook open, his voice clipped. "We've confirmed the cyanide came from the medicine bottle," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "Someone in this house had access, opportunity, and motive. I want to know where each of you was yesterday morning when that tea was poured." Letitia, her ear still bandaged, sat ramrod straight, her hands folded. "I was in the dining room, setting the table. Dora was with me, chatting as usual." Poured her tea from my pot, as she asked. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted a faint tremor in her fingers, a crack in her polished facade. Patrick, leaning against the mantel, shrugged. "I was out back, having a smoke by the shed. Didn't see a thing until Mitzi screamed." His casual tone felt forced, his eyes darting to Julia, who sat with her arms crossed, her auburn hair catching the firelight. Julia's voice was sharp, almost defiant. "I told you, Inspector, I was in my room, brushing my hair. Mitzi brought me coffee earlier, so I didn't come down until the commotion started." She met Craddock's gaze, but her fingers twisted a ring on her left hand, a nervous tick Miss Marple hadn't seen before. Mitzi, hovering by the door, wrung her apron. "I was in the kitchen, cooking porridge. I bring Miss Julia coffee, yes, but I see nothing, only Miss Bunner falling." Her voice broke, and she fled, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Craddock's eyes narrowed. "Miss Simmons, you're certain you were upstairs the entire time? Nobody saw you until after Dora collapsed?" Julia's chin lifted. "I don't see why that matters. I wasn't near the tea or that wretched bottle." But her tone was too sharp, her eyes too quick to slide away, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind catching on a detail from the tea-shop Julia's cryptic mention of the station. And now this insistence on her alibi. Miss Marple spoke, her voice mild as milk. "My dear, I seem to recall you mentioned enjoying a film recently, the one at the Regal Cinema, wasn't it? The Lady Vanishes. Such a clever plot." She smiled, her eyes soft but piercing. Julia blinked, caught off guard. "Oh yes, I saw it last week, quite thrilling." She hesitated, then added, "I went alone though. I like matinees." Miss Marple's smile didn't waver. "How interesting. I thought the Regal was showing Rebecca this month. The Lady Vanishes was last spring, wasn't it?" Her tone was gentle, but the room seemed to tighten. The air charged with the weight of her words. Julia's face flushed, her ring twisting stopping abruptly. "I must have mixed them up. It was Rebecca, of course." She laughed, a brittle sound, but her eyes flicked to Patrick, who frowned, his nonchalance fading. Craddock pounced. "Miss Simmons, if you weren't at the cinema, where were you?" Yesterday morning. And don't tell me your room again. We've got a witness, a groundskeeper, who saw someone near the greenhouse just before breakfast. A woman, auburn hair, slipping out the back gate. Julia's composure cracked, her green eyes flashing with panic. All right, fine, she snapped, her voice rising. I wasn't in my room, not the whole time. I went to the greenhouse, to fetch some herbs for Mitzi. She asked for parsley, and I thought I'd help. She glared at Craddock, daring him to challenge her. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was alight. The greenhouse, where she'd found that dusting of white powder cyanide, perhaps. Julia's story was plausible, but too convenient, and her slip about the film suggested a lie. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen such alibis unravel, often hiding smaller sins that pointed to larger ones. Craddock pressed on. Herbs, at 7 in the morning, in a frost. You'll forgive me if I find that unlikely. What were you really doing, Miss Simmons? Julia's lips parted, then closed, her defiance crumbling. She glanced at Letitia, who watched her with an unreadable expression, then at Patrick, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. I wasn't getting herbs, she admitted, her voice low. I took a silver cigarette case from Letty's study last week. I needed money, and I thought I could pawn it in Meddenham Wells. I went to the greenhouse to hide it, in case anyone searched my room. The room stilled, the confession hanging like smoke. Letitia's face hardened, but she said nothing, her silence louder than words. Patrick swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. Craddock's pen scratched in his notebook. Theft, Miss Simmons. That's a serious admission. Where's the case now? In the greenhouse, under a flower pot, Julia said, her voice barely audible. I was going to return it, I swear. I didn't touch that bottle or Dora's tea. I'm not a murderer. Craddock nodded, his expression unyielding. We'll check the greenhouse. If your story holds, you're clear of murder for now. But don't leave the village. He turned to Letitia. Miss Blacklock did. You know about this theft. Letitia's voice was cool. I noticed the case missing, but thought I'd misplaced it. Julia, you should have asked for help. Her tone held a hint of reproach, but her eyes were guarded, as if weighing more than Julia's confession. As Craddock left to search the greenhouse, Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away. She approached Julia, who sat staring at the floor, her face flushed with shame. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, it's brave to admit a mistake. But secrets, even small ones, have a way of tangling with larger ones. If there's more, it's best to say it now. Julia shook her head, her eyes wet. There's nothing else. I was stupid, that's all. But her voice trembled, and Miss Marple wondered if the cigarette case was the whole story or a distraction from something deeper. Later, in the privacy of her guest room, Miss Marple pondered the morning's events. Julia's alibi had unraveled, revealing a theft that, while serious, didn't explain Dora's death or Rudy Scherz's. The greenhouse powder suggested the cyanide source, and Julia's presence there was damning, yet her confession felt genuine. Had she stumbled into the killer's path, or was she playing a cleverer game? And Letitia's reaction, cool, almost detached, hinted at knowledge she wasn't sharing. Miss Marple opened her handbag, retrieving a scrap of paper she'd found tucked in Dora's knitting basket, unnoticed by Craddock's men. It was a letter fragment, written in Dora's spidery hand. Letty, we must tell someone about Charlotte. If they know, it could, the rest was torn. But the words chilled Miss Marple. Charlotte Blacklock, the sister whose gravestone bore. A cryptic message was at the heart of this, she was sure. Dora had known something, perhaps about the royal spa or Randall Godler's fortune, and it had cost her life. She thought of her rumour, now spreading through the village. The bottle near the church was a fiction, but it had stirred the household, pushing Julia to confess. The killer, Miss Marple suspected, was watching, waiting for a misstep. She decided to tighten the trap, perhaps by visiting the post office, where Miss Hinchcliffe had seen a stranger. Gossip, she knew, was a mirror, reflecting truths the guilty couldn't hide. As dusk fell, Miss Marple joined Letitia for tea in the parlour, the house quiet, save for the tick of the mantel clock. "A dreadful day," she said, her voice soft. Poor Dora. Did she ever mention her worries, Miss Blacklock? She seemed so anxious. Letitia's cup paused halfway to her lips. Dora was always anxious, she said, her tone light but strained. Old memories, nothing more. She missed our school days, I think. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment something flickered fear or defiance. Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. The letter fragment, Julia's confession. The greenhouse powder all pointed to a truth buried in Letitia's past, tied to Charlotte and a fortune that drew death like moths to a flame. As she sipped her tea, she felt the puzzle shifting, the pieces closer to alignment. The alibi had unravelled, but the killer remained, and Miss Marple's trap was poised to catch them. Chapter 7. The hidden ere the late October sun hung low over Chipping Cleghorn, casting long shadows across the village's frost-dusted lanes. Inside little paddocks, the air was thick with unspoken questions, the deaths of Rudy Schurz and Dora. Bonner weighing like stones on the household. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, a small book-lined room that smelled of leather and wax, her knitting a quiet counterpoint to the tension. Julia Simmons' confession about the stolen cigarette case had cleared her of murder but revealed a crack in the household's facade. And Dora's letter, fragment, Letty, "We must tell someone about Charlotte," pointed to a secret tide. To Letitia Blacklock's past, Miss Marple's rumour about a bottle near the church was still stirring the village, and she watched for ripples, knowing the killer was close. The morning brought Inspector Craddock, his face lined with the strain of a case growing colder. He stood by the library window, his notebook open, addressing Letitia, Patrick, and Julia, who sat in a tense semicircle. "The cigarette case was exactly where Miss Simmons said," he announced, his voice clipped. "No fingerprints but hers. But the greenhouse powder cyanide, as Miss Marple suspected, suggests someone used it to tamper with that medicine bottle. Miss Blacklock, any enemies from your London days who might want you dead?" Letitia, her ear bandaged a stark white against her dark hair, folded her hands. "None that I know of, Inspector. I was Randall Godler's secretary, paperwork, appointments. Nothing to inspire murder." Her tone was even, but Miss Marple caught a flicker in her eyes. A shadow of something withheld. Patrick, slouched in an armchair, snorted. "Enemies, Letty's too charming for that. Probably some local nutter, stirred up by that Gazette nonsense." His grin was forced, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the armrest. Julia, her auburn hair loose today, shot him a look. "Don't be flippant, Pat. 2 people are dead, and Letty was nearly the 3rd. Her voice held an edge, but her eyes avoided Craddock's, as if her confession had left her raw. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind turning over Dora's. "Letter," Charlotte Blacklock, the sister buried in the churchyard, was the key, she was sure. The gravestone's inscription, "Her light shines on," and Rudy shows his inquiries about Lottie Black at the Royal Spa suggested a hidden truth, perhaps tied to Godler's fortune. But why poison Dora? Had she known too much, or was she simply in the wrong place? The conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. Miss Hinchcliffe strode in, her tweed coat dusted with leaves, her face set in a scowl. "Craddock, you ought to know saw that stranger again, near the post office last night. Same city coat, lurking by the phone box, looked like he was watching this house." She glanced at Letitia, her eyes narrowing. "You sure you don't know anyone with a grudge?" Letitia's smile was tight. "Quite sure, Miss Hinchcliffe, but thank you for your vigilance." Her composure was flawless, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened, crumpling the edge of her sleeve. Craddock jotted a note. "Description, please. Height, build, anything distinctive. Tall, lean, dark hat pulled low," Miss Hinchcliffe said gruffly. "Moved like he didn't want to be seen. I'd have chased him, but Murgatroyd dragged me home." She snorted, but her concern was clear. Miss Marple spoke, her voice gentle but precise. "How curious. The night of Dora's death, Mitzi mentioned a shadow by the laurel bushes. Perhaps the same man." She paused, her eyes on Letitia, who looked away, busying herself with a teapot. Craddock frowned. "We'll patrol the village tonight. Miss Blacklock, I suggest you lock all doors and windows. This stranger might be our killer, or an accomplice." He snapped his notebook shut and left, promising updates by evening as the household dispersed. Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Bantry, finding her at the village hall, organizing a charity bazaar. The hall was a flurry of bunting and biscuit tins, but Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit up at Miss Marple's arrival. "Jane, any news?" "The village is positively feverish. Someone swore they saw a bottle by the church, just like your rumour." She laughed, then sobered. "Poor Dora. Do you think it was meant for Letitia?" Miss Marple nodded, settling onto a folding chair. "I'm certain of it, Dolly. But Dora's death suggests she knew something dangerous. Something about Charlotte Blacklock. Perhaps I need to know more about Randall Godler's will. Was Letitia his only heir?" Mrs. Bantry's brow furrowed. "Not quite. I heard from old Mr. Harmon, the vicar, that Godler's will was peculiar. If his wife died, Letitia got the lot, but if Letitia died first, it went to some cousins Pip and Emma, I think. Nobody knows who they are, though. Godler was cagey, kept them out of sight. Why, Jane? Think it's about the money?" "Money is a powerful motive," Miss Marple said, her needles appearing as if summoned. "I'd like to speak to someone who knew Godler's household. A solicitor, perhaps, or a servant. They see more than they're credited for." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. "Brilliant. There's Mr. Pettigrew, a retired solicitor in Medenham Wells. He handled Godler's affairs years ago. Lives in a cottage by the river now, fusses over his roses. Shall I ring him?" Miss Marple smiled. "Please do. And ask if he remembers a maid from Godler's London house, someone who might have known Letitia and Charlotte." That afternoon, Miss Marple took the bus to Medenham Wells, a market town 10 miles away. Mr. Pettigrew's cottage was a charming affair, its garden ablaze with late roses. The solicitor, a wiry man with a shock of white hair, greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Mrs. Bantry said, "You're asking about Randall Godler," he said, pouring tea in a cluttered parlour. Fine man, but a bit of a sphinx. What's this about? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes gentle but probing. A matter in Chipping Cleghorn, Mr. Pettigrew. 2 deaths, possibly tied to Godler's fortune. I understand Letitia Blacklock was his secretary, and there was a will involving her and others, Pip and Emma, perhaps. Pettigrew's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. True enough. Godler's will was odd. His wife Belle got everything while she lived. On her death, Letitia Blacklock inherits the bulk millions properties, the lot. But if Letitia dies first, it passes to Pip and Emma, his sister's children. Nobody's seen them since they were tots, sent abroad during the war. Godler never said where, only that they'd come forward when the time came. He leaned back, his fingers drumming. You think someone's killing to get that fortune? Miss Marple's smile was faint. I think someone's killing to protect a secret. Did you know Charlotte Blacklock, Letitia's sister? Pettigrew frowned, searching his memory. Vaguely. Quiet girl, sickly, I heard. Died young, didn't she? Letitia never spoke of her, but there was a maid Marie Flynn, worked for in the 30s, knew the Blacklock girls well. Lives in the village now, runs a boarding house. Miss Marple's needles paused, her heart quickening. A maid would know the household's secrets, jealousies, promises, betrayals. Thank you, Mr. Pettigrew. Might you have Mary Flynn's address? As she left with the address scribbled on a slip of paper, Miss Marple felt the puzzle shift. Pip and Emma, the hidden heirs, were a new thread. And Charlotte's death, or perhaps her survival, tied them to Letitia's present danger. The stranger, seen by Miss Hinchcliffe, the cyanide in the greenhouse. Dora's letter all pointed to a fortune worth killing for, and a past worth hiding. Back in Chipping Cleghorn, Miss Marple visited the post office, hoping to stir her rumour. Further, the postmistress, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Finch, was eager to talk. Heard about that bottle by the church, she whispered, leaning over the counter. And I saw a man there last night, tall, in a dark coat. Dropped something, shiny in the grass, then scarpered when he saw my light. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. How curious. Did you find it? Mrs. Finch shook her head. Too dark, and I wasn't poking about alone, but it looked like a key, maybe. She paused, her voice dropping. You think it's tied to poor Miss Bonner, perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. A key, she thought, to a door, a box, or a secret. She thanked Mrs. Finch and left, her mind turning to Mary Flynn. The maid's memories could unlock Charlotte's story, and perhaps the killer's motive. As evening fell, Miss Marple telephoned Mary Flynn, arranging a meeting for the next day. The trap of her rumour was tightening, the villagers' eyes watching for the stranger. Letitia, Patrick, Julia, someone in Little Paddocks, was hiding more than a cigarette case. And Miss Marple's quiet questions were drawing them out, one thread at a time. Chapter 8. The trap sprung. The twilight of Chipping Cleghorn draped Little Paddocks in a hush, the frost now a delicate lace across its windows. Inside, the house felt like a coiled spring, the deaths of Rudy Schurz and Dora Bunner casting shadows that no fire could dispel. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlour, her knitting a soft whisper against the ticking of the mantel clock. Her rumour about a bottle near the church had spread like wildfire, and the villagers' whispers, a stranger, a dropped key had stirred the household. The revelation of Randall Godler's will, with its hidden heirs, Pip and Emma, had tightened the web around Letitia Blacklock, and Miss Marple sensed the killer was near. their nerves fraying under her subtle pressure. The morning had brought news from Mary Flynn, the former maid, who'd agreed to meet Miss Marple, but was delayed by a sick child. Her letter, delivered by post, hinted at memories of Charlotte Blacklock, a sweet girl but troubled, and promised details tomorrow. Miss Marple tucked the letter into her handbag, her mind turning to the strangers seen by Miss Hinchcliffe and the postmistress's mention of a key. A key to what? A secret, perhaps, tied to Charlotte's gravestone or Gaudelaire's fortune. Dora's letter, fragment, Letty. We must tell someone about Charlotte, suggested a truth Letitia was desperate to hide. Inspector Craddock arrived at noon, his face drawn but determined. He gathered the household, Letitia, Patrick, Julia, and a subdued Mitzi in the drawing room, where the memory of Rudy Scherz's death lingered. "We've searched the churchyard," he said, his voice sharp. "No bottle, but we found this." He held up a small brass key, its edges worn, found in the grass near the lich gate. "Recognize it, anyone?" Letitia's eyes flicked to the key, her face impassive. "No, Inspector. It could belong to anyone in the village." Her voice was calm, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her jaw. A telltale sign of strain. Patrick, lounging by the window, shrugged. "Looks like a shed key, nothing special." But his eyes lingered on Letitia, a question in there. Depths. Julia, her auburn hair pulled back, said nothing, her fingers twisting her ringer. Habit. Miss Marple, now recognized as a sign of nerves. Mitzi, polishing a silver tray in the corner, muttered, "It's cursed, that key, like this house." Her outburst drew a sharp look from Letitia, who silenced her with a raised hand. Craddock pocketed the key. "We're staging a reenactment of Scherz's shooting tonight, here, at 6:30. Same conditions, lights dimmed. Everyone in their original places. I want to see what we missed." He fixed Letitia with a steady gaze. "Miss Blacklock, you'll play your part. If this was a setup, someone in this room knows more than they're saying." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind alight. A reenactment was bold, a chance to jolt the killer into a mistake. Her rumor had already pushed Julia to confess her theft. Now, this stage drama might crack Letitia's composure, or someone else's. She spoke, her voice gentle. "A splendid idea, Inspector. People reveal themselves under pressure, don't they? Like actors forgetting their lines." Letitia's smile was thin. "I'll do whatever helps, of course, but it's distressing, reliving that night." Her hand touched her bandaged ear, a gesture Miss Marple found almost theatrical. As the day wore on, the household buzzed with unease. Patrick paced the garden, his usual charm replaced by a restless energy. Julia retreated to her room, claiming a headache, but Miss Marple caught her peering from an upstairs window, watching the lane. Mitzi, tasked with preparing tea, dropped a saucer, her nerves fraying further. Letitia moved through the house like a general, her composure a shield, but Miss Marple saw the cracks her quick glances at the clock, her avoidance of the mantel where the photograph of the old friend stood at 6 p.m. The guests from that fateful night gathered again. Mrs. Swetnam, her peacock-feathered hat bobbing, Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd whispering about the stranger, and Colonel Easterbrook grumbling about police theatrics, with Laura clinging to his arm. Miss Marple took her corner armchair, her knitting a prop that let her observe unnoticed. The room was arranged as before, chairs in a loose circle. The chandelier dimmed to mimic that evening's glow. Craddock stood by the door, his eyes scanning. The group will recreate the moment Scherz entered. Miss Blacklock, you were by the fireplace. Patrick, near the window. Julia, you'd just come downstairs. Everyone else, take your places. He nodded to Constable Legg, stationed in the hall. On my signal, we'll dim the lights. I want to hear what you saw, what you felt. Letitia positioned herself by the fireplace, her face pale but composed. Patrick slouched by the window, his eyes darting to Julia, who stood near the staircase, her posture rigid. Miss Marple watched Letitia closely, noting the way her fingers gripped the mantel, her knuckles white. The clock ticked toward 6:30, the room growing hushed, the air thick with anticipation. Craddock raised his hand. Now, the lights dimmed, plunging the room into a twilight haze. The guests shifted, their breaths audible. Then, from the hall, came a sharp crack of firecracker, not a gunshot, but close enough to make Mrs. Swettenham gasp and Miss Murgatroyd clutch Miss Hinch. Letitia flinched, her hand flying to her ear, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to echo that night. Miss Marple's heart quickened. That flinch was no act. Letitia's fear was real, triggered by the sound, the memory of the bullet that grazed her. But was it fear of an external threat, or of her own secrets unraveling? The lights flared back on, revealing the room in stark clarity. Letitia's hand dropped, her composure returning, but not before Miss Marple saw the tremor in her fingers. Stepped forward, his voice calm but probing. Miss Blacklock, you moved exactly as you did that night, almost as if you expected a shot. Care to explain? Letitia laughed, a brittle sound. It was startling, Inspector. That noise brought it all back. I'm only human. But her eyes darted to the door, as if expecting Scherz's ghost to appear. Patrick broke the tension, clapping his hands. Well done, Craddock. Quite the show. But what's it prove? That we're all jumpy. His grin was back, but it didn't reach his eyes. Julia, however, was silent, her gaze fixed on Letitia. Miss Marple caught the look, a mix of suspicion and something deeper, almost pity. She filed it away, her mind turning to the key, the stranger, and Mary Flynn's letter. The reenactment had confirmed Letitia's fear, but it hadn't exposed the killer, not yet. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the rug where Scherz had fallen. She noticed a handkerchief, half hidden under a chair, its corner embroidered with a delicate C. Charlotte, she thought, or a coincidence. She retrieved it discreetly, tucking it into her handbag. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once solved a theft by a monogrammed glove. This could be another thread to pull. Outside, Miss Hinchcliffe approached, her voice low. Saw something odd during that reenactment. Julia, she wasn't where she said she was that night. She was closer to the door, not the stairs. Think. She's lying again. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. People often adjust their stories, Miss Hinchcliffe, but it's what they hide behind the lies that matters. She thanked her and walked into the dusk, the handkerchief heavy in her bag. Back at her guest room, Miss Marple examined the handkerchief. It's silk-worn but fine, the C stitched in blue thread. It wasn't Letitia's her linens bore. An L and Dora's were plain. Charlotte's, perhaps, or another clue to the past. Letitia guarded so fiercely. The reenactment had sprung her trap, revealing Letitia's fear and Julia's discrepancy, but the killer remained elusive. Mary Flynn's meeting tomorrow, Miss Marple hoped, would shed light on Charlotte's story and the fortune that drove someone to murder. As she settled into bed, the clock chiming 9, Miss Marple heard a faint creak outside her door. She paused, her hand on her knitting, but no shadow followed. The house was watching, she thought, and so was she. The trap had sprung, and the killer, she sensed, was closer to breaking. Chapter 9. The final revelation. The morning sun broke through the clouds over Chipping Cleghorn, casting a fragile warmth on little paddocks, where the weight of 2 death's-ruddy shires and Dora Bunner hung like a storm yet to break. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, the silk handkerchief with its embroidered C resting on her lap, its delicate stitches a silent accusation. The reenactment had revealed Letitia Blacklock's fear, and the rumour of a bottle near the church had stirred the household, but the killer remained elusive. Today, Miss Marple knew the truth would surface, drawn out by a final gathering and the testimony of Mary Flynn, the maid who knew Charlotte Blacklock's secrets. Breakfast. The household was subdued. Letitia, her ear bandage gone but a faint scar visible, poured tea with a steady hand, though her eyes flicked to the door as if expecting an intruder. Patrick Simmons, his usual charm muted, picked at his toast, while Julia, her auburn hair tightly pinned, watched Letitia with a gaze that held both wariness and resolve. Mitzi, clearing plates, moved with a quiet caution, her earlier hysterics replaced by a resigned fear. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, felt the tension coiling tighter, the puzzle's pieces Charlotte's gravestone, Godler's will, the cyanide, the handkerchief poised to align. Inspector Craddock arrived at 10, his face set with determination. He'd met Mary Flynn that morning, he announced, and her testimony had shifted the case. "We're gathering everyone in the drawing room at noon," he said, his voice firm. "Miss Blacklock, Mr. and Miss Simmons, you'll be there, along with the original guests. We're ending this today." Letitia's smile was brittle. "Of course, Inspector, I want this nightmare over as much as anyone." But her fingers tightened on her cup, and Miss Marple saw a shadow cross her face. Fleeting but unmistakable. As the hour approached, Miss Marple visited the churchyard, needing the quiet to think. The gravestone of Charlotte Blacklock, with its cryptic "Her light shines on," stood unchanged. But Mary Flynn's letter had hinted at trouble, a secret Charlotte carried, tied to Letitia and Randall Godler. The handkerchief, found after the reenactment, bore a C, and Miss Marple's mind turned to a diary she'd glimpsed in Letitia's study, its lock matching the brass key found by the church. A diary, perhaps, that held the truth about Charlotte and Letitia. At noon, the drawing room filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Swetnam, her hat more subdued today. Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd, whispering fiercely. Colonel Easterbrook, his bluster softened by unease, with Laura at his side. Patrick and Julia sat apart, their usual banter absent, while Mitzi hovered by the door, her eyes wide. Letitia stood by the fireplace, her posture regal but strained. As Craddock took the centre of the room, Miss Marple settled into her corner armchair, her knitting a prop that let her observe unnoticed. She'd slipped the handkerchief to Craddock earlier, along with a quiet suggestion to check Letitia's study for a diary. Now she watched, her heart steady but expectant. As Craddock began, "We've unravelled the truth," he said, his voice cutting through the room's hush. Rudy Scher's death was no robbery gone wrong, and Dora Booner's wasn't a mistake. This was about a fortune Randall Godler's and a secret kept for years. He held up the brass key. This opened a diary found in Miss Blacklock's study. It belonged to Charlotte Blacklock, and it tells a story Miss Blacklock didn't want known. Letitia's face paled, her hand gripping the mantle. "Inspector, that's absurd. "I've no idea what you're talking about." But her voice trembled, and Miss Marple saw Julia's eyes narrow, as if sensing a truth she'd half guessed. Craddock pressed on. Mary Flynn, Godler's maid, knew both Blacklock sisters. Letitia and Charlotte, close as twins, worked for Godler in London. But Charlotte had a secret. She was Letitia. The real Letitia died in 1940 of illness, and Charlotte, fearing she'd lose her place in Godler's world, took her sister's identity. The gravestone was a lie, a cover too. Claim the fortune. The room gasped, Mrs. Swettenham's fan fluttering wildly. Miss Hinchcliffe swore under her breath, while Patrick stared at Letitia, his mouth open. Julia's hand flew to her lips, her ring-twisting stopped. Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but clear. "It's ingenious, really." Charlotte became Letitia, living her sister's life, poised to inherit millions. But Rudy Schurz, a porter at the Royal Spa, recognized her from 1940 when she was Lottie Black. He came to blackmail her, didn't he? Letitia Charlotte shook her head, her eyes wild. "This is nonsense. I'm Letitia Blacklock. My sister died, and her voice broke, and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. Craddock held up the diary, its pages worn, but legible. Charlotte wrote it, all her fear, her plan, her guilt. Schurz demanded money to stay quiet. You placed the Gazette announcement, Miss Blacklock, staging a murder to draw a crowd, a perfect cover to shoot Schurz and claim. Self-defense. The graze on your ear was deliberate, wasn't it? To make you a victim." Letitia's hands dropped, her face ashen. "No, I didn't wouldn't." But her voice faltered, and Miss Marple saw the truth in her eyes, a confession waiting to spill. "Dora was the problem," Miss Marple said gently, her needles still. "She knew you as Charlotte from school. She called you Letty, but sometimes Lottie, didn't she? That slip in the tea shop, her letter they showed. She was remembering, questioning. You poisoned the tea meant for you, knowing Dora would take it. A desperate act to silence her." The room was silent, the weight of the accusation pressing down. Julia stood, her voice shaking. "Is it true, Letty? You're Charlotte? You let Dora die?" Her eyes were wet, her loyalty crumbling. Letitia's shoulders slumped, her defiance breaking. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm Charlotte. Letitia died, and I took her place. Godler trusted her, loved her. I couldn't lose that life. Schurz found me, demanded money. I thought if he died in a robbery, no one would know. But Darashi started remembering, asking about the past. I panicked. The cyanide. It was meant to look like an attack on me." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. Patrick swore, his face pale. "You let us live with a lie. Dora was family." His anger was raw, but Julia's silence was heavier. Her eyes fixed on the floor. Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "Charlotte Blacklock, you're under arrest for the murders of Rudy Schurz and Dora Boona," he signalled. Constable Legg, who gently escorted Charlotte from the room, her sobs echoing down the hall. The guests sat stunned. Mrs. Swettenham fanning herself, Miss Murgatroyd clutching Miss Hinchcliffe's arm. Colonel Easterbrook muttered about shocking deceit, while Laura wept quietly. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away, her heart heavy but satisfied. The handkerchief, the diary, Mary Flynn's memories, they'd unravelled the truth, as she'd known they would. As the guests dispersed, Julia approached Miss Marple, her voice low. "You knew, didn't you? From the start, you saw through her." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. Not from the start, my dear. But people are like skeins of wool tangled, but with a thread to follow. Charlotte's was fear, and it led her to ruin. She patted Julia's hand, sensing her guilt over the stolen cigarette case. You'll be all right. Truth is a heavy thing, but it sets us free. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry in her cottage, the fire casting a warm glow. Jane, you're a marvel, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, pouring sherry. Charlotte Blacklock, living a lie all these years, and that fortune will Pip and Emma get it now. Miss Marple nodded, sipping her sherry. I expect so, if they can be found. But Chipping Cleghorn is quieter tonight, Dolly. That's what matters. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where secrets too had unravelled under her quiet gaze. The village would heal, its whispers fading, and Miss Marple, with her handbag and her knitting, would return home, ready for the next puzzle life might bring.